So let's talk about 1968. It wasn't just any year. It was a year when the world seemed to catch fire, and the ones holding the matches were young people. All over the globe, from Paris to Mexico City, from Chicago to Prague, students and young workers decided they had had enough. They were tired of the old ways. They were tired of the old men making decisions that sent them to die in wars they didn't believe in. This was the moment the post-war generation, the baby boomers, truly found its voice. And that voice was loud, it was angry, and it demanded to be heard, creating a seismic shift that we still feel today. What was everyone so angry about? Well, a lot of things. In the United States, the Vietnam War was a huge, festering wound. Young men were being drafted to fight in a conflict that seemed pointless and brutal, and the nightly news brought the horror right into their living rooms. But it wasn't just the war. There was also a massive struggle for civil rights. African Americans and their allies were fighting against centuries of segregation and injustice. In Europe, the anger was pointed at rigid, old-fashioned governments and universities that felt more like factories for conformity than places of learning. It was a global feeling of being stuck in a system that didn't care about you. This wasn't just a few isolated incidents. It was a connected, global phenomenon. Think about it. For the first time in history, television was bringing the world into people's homes. A student protesting in Paris could see news footage of students protesting in Berkeley, California. They saw they weren't alone. This created a powerful sense of solidarity. They were all part of the same fight, even if their specific complaints were different. They were fighting for a more just, more free, and more authentic world. They were fighting for a future that they could actually believe in, not one that was handed down to them by a previous generation. So 1968 became the perfect storm. You had a massive generation of young people, born after the devastation of World War II, who had grown up with relative prosperity, but also with the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. They were better educated than their parents and more willing to question authority. They saw the hypocrisy of their leaders who preached freedom while supporting dictatorships or waging colonial wars. This wasn't just youthful rebellion for the sake of it. It was a deep, philosophical rejection of the world as it was, and a passionate, desperate attempt to build something better in its place. The protests of 1968 were not a single coordinated event. They were a series of explosions that flared up across the planet, each with its own local flavor. In France, it all started with students at the Sorbonne in Paris. They were protesting against outdated university rules and a lack of job opportunities. But it quickly grew into something much bigger. When the police reacted with violence, workers joined the students in solidarity. Soon, nearly 10 million French workers were on strike, paralyzing the entire country. The streets of Paris became a battleground, filled with barricades, tear gas, and slogans like, "Be realistic, demand the impossible." It almost brought down the government. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic in the United States, the anger was just as intense. The assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. in April and Robert F. Kennedy in June shattered any remaining sense of hope and stability. Protests against the Vietnam War reached a fever pitch. At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, thousands of young anti-war protesters gathered. They were met with what an official report later called a police riot. Officers brutally beat protesters, journalists, and bystanders, all while the cameras rolled. This violence showed a deeply divided America and exposed the rage simmering just beneath the surface of society. But the fight for freedom wasn't limited to the West. Behind the Iron Curtain in Czechoslovakia, a movement known as the Prague Spring was underway. The country's leader, Alexander Dubček, tried to create socialism with a human face. This meant allowing more freedom of speech, less state control, and more democracy. For a few months, it felt like a new dawn. Young people embraced this new openness with incredible passion and creativity. But this experiment in freedom was terrifying to the Soviet Union. In August, Soviet tanks rolled into Prague to crush the movement, a brutal reminder that the desire for change could have devastating consequences. From Mexico City, where students protesting government authoritarianism were massacred just days before the Summer Olympics, to West Germany, where students battled police over university reforms and the country's Nazi past, the story was the same. Young people were on the front lines, risking everything. They were challenging the very foundations of power, whether that power was capitalist, communist, or something in between. They believed that a different world was possible, and they were willing to fight for it on the streets, in their universities, and in their workplaces. 1968 was the year the youth of the world roared. You can't talk about 1968 without talking about the culture that fueled it. This wasn't just a political revolution. It was a cultural one, too. Music especially became the heartbeat of the movement. Artists like Bob Dylan had already taught a generation to question authority with songs like "The Times They Are A-Changin'." But by 1968, the sound had gotten louder and more confrontational. The Rolling Stones sang "Street Fighting Man," capturing the rebellious energy on the boulevards of Paris. James Brown's "Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud" became a powerful anthem for the civil rights and Black Power movements. This music wasn't just background noise. It was an essential part of the protest itself. It spread ideas, it created a sense of shared identity, and it gave people courage. When you heard a song on the radio that spoke directly to your anger and your hopes, you felt less alone. It was a sign that others felt the same way. The Beatles released their White Album, which included the song "Revolution," questioning the methods of change. This showed that even the biggest band in the world was grappling with the same questions that protesters were shouting about in the streets. The soundtrack of '68 was a mix of folk, rock, soul, and psychedelia, and it all carried a message of change. Art also played a crucial role. In Paris, the student-run art school, the Atelier Populaire, churned out thousands of brilliant, simple posters that became iconic symbols of the May uprising. They used powerful images and sharp slogans to communicate their message quickly and effectively. A poster showing a factory smokestack turning into a clenched fist was a perfect visual for the alliance between students and workers. This art wasn't meant for museums. It was meant for the streets. It was pasted on walls, carried in marches, and became a weapon in the struggle for public opinion, proving art could be a powerful tool for political action. The cultural shift went even deeper, challenging social norms about everything from clothing and hairstyles to relationships and sexuality. The counterculture, which had been bubbling up for years, exploded into the mainstream. Long hair, bell-bottoms, and tie-dye were more than just fashion statements. They were symbols of a rejection of the stiff, conservative culture of their parents' generation. This desire for personal liberation was inseparable from the desire for political liberation. The young people of 1968 believed that to change the world, you first had to change yourself. And that included the music you listened to, the art you made, and the way you chose to live your life. So, what did all this protesting actually achieve? In the short term, it looked like a failure. The governments in France and the United States didn't fall. The tanks in Prague crushed the dream of a new kind of socialism. Many of the specific demands of the protesters were not met immediately. The old guard seemed to have won the battle. But that's a very simplistic way to look at it. The events of 1968 planted seeds that would grow for decades. The world was fundamentally changed, even if it wasn't immediately obvious. The protests shattered the post-war consensus and opened up new political possibilities. The most profound legacy of 1968 was the change in social attitudes. The movements gave a massive push to feminist, environmental, and gay rights movements that would flourish in the 1970s and beyond. The questioning of authority became a permanent feature of Western culture. People became more skeptical of their governments and more willing to challenge the status quo. The civil rights movement made irreversible gains, and the anti-war movement eventually helped turn public opinion against the Vietnam War, contributing to America's withdrawal. The year 1968 showed that ordinary people, especially young people, could stand up and make their voices heard on a global stage. The lessons of 1968 are still incredibly relevant today. Whenever we see young people marching for climate justice, racial equality, or democratic freedoms, we are seeing the echoes of 1968. The activists of today use many of the same tactics: mass marches, student occupations, and the use of art and social media to spread their message. The spirit of 68 lives on in the belief that a better world is not just a dream, but something worth fighting for. It teaches us that change often comes from the bottom up, driven by the passion and idealism of those who have the most at stake in the future. Ultimately, 1968 serves as a powerful reminder that history is not just something that happens to us. It is something we can make. The young people of that year didn't wait for permission to demand a better world. They took to the streets and made their case with their bodies, their voices, and their creativity. They may not have won every battle, but they fundamentally changed the conversation. They showed that youth is not a time for waiting, but a time for action. And that is a lesson that every generation, in every corner of the world, can learn from. The world is still shaking from the energy unleashed in that single fiery year.